Hi everyone, I'm Jeannie Jones. Welcome to Session 1 of Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament. Today we're going to look at the 3 ways that the Old Testament reveals Jesus. But first, let me tell you what this creative devotional guide, Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament, will do for you. In this 13-week series, you'll grow in faith as you see God's eternal plan for you. You'll experience God's incredible, unchanging love for you. You'll grasp the Bible's big story, and you'll know your own place in it. And you'll rejoice in the amazing future awaiting you. Did I just mention your future? I did. That's because when you see all the incredible ways that God fulfilled his promises in Jesus' first coming, you're going to be assured that God will fulfill all of his promises about Jesus' second coming. And those promises are great. In fact, every chapter in Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament begins with the Old Testament, goes to Jesus' day to show you how Jesus fulfilled those promises, then shows us what that means for us today, and then ends in what's going to happen in the coming kingdom. Let me tell you a little bit about my story. I remember I was so excited the first time I got a Bible that had cross-references. Those are those little lists of verses in the margins that tell you verses that are related to the passages that you're reading. I was excited, and one of the things that I was really looking forward to was going to all those places in the New Testament where it said Jesus fulfilled something in the Old Testament, because then I could go and look at the prophecies. But I quickly found out that I didn't have enough background to understand them. So instead of continued excitement, I was confused, and here's why. I didn't know the situations that the prophecies were addressing. I didn't have any of the historical background. I also didn't understand the Jewish practices that they were talking about. And finally, I didn't know there were 3 ways that the Old Testament reveals Jesus. We're going to resolve all that. First of all, in just a moment, I'm going to explain the 3 ways that the Old Testament reveals Jesus to us. Second, I've created for you 7 timelines, and they're free. I'm going to put the link to them in the comments below. So after you're done with this video, you can hop right over there and download those and use them as you go through the book, Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament. Third, we're going to be proceeding in a mostly chronological order. That's the best way to make sense of how the Old Testament reveals Jesus. And then fourth, the book is going to explain the historical background and all those Jewish practices. And that's important because it turns out most of the Jewish practices that are referred to in the prophetic books, Jesus fulfills them. Ready to get started? Good. We're going to use, for our example today, the most well-known prophecy about Jesus, namely that the Old Testament predicted a Messiah, and the New Testament says that Jesus is that Messiah. Well, what is a Messiah? It comes from the Hebrew word for anointed one. You see, all the kings that ruled from Jerusalem were called anointed ones or messiahs. That's because they were anointed when they were crowned. Now, there are a few other offices that were anointed too. The priests were anointed for their service, and sometimes prophets were anointed. But for the most part, when people were talking about their expectation of a Messiah, of an anointed one, they were talking about a king. They were looking for a king. The first way that the Old Testament reveals Jesus is through the promises. The first promise that we're going to look at is one that God made to David, to King David. He said that David would have an offspring who would build a temple and whose throne would last forever. This is a very important promise. It's known as the Davidic covenant. Now, a covenant is a special kind of promise. It's more like a contract that governs relationships, kind of like marriage vows. There are a number of covenants in the Bible, and all of them point to Jesus and say something about Jesus. Let's read God's promise to David in 2 Samuel 7, 12-13. It says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The first way the Old Testament reveals Jesus then is through promises, and in particular through covenants. The second way that the Old Testament reveals Jesus is through direct prophecy. Now, these ways that reveal Jesus sometimes overlap, and this is one of those instances. The Davidic covenant was delivered by a prophet, and it is a direct prophecy as well as being a promise. In fact, many of the promises in the Old Testament are also prophecies. Now, many Jews thought that David's son Solomon was the one that fulfilled that promise to David. After all, he had built a temple, so why wouldn't he also be the one whose throne would last forever through a series of descendants that went on and on and on? But David had warned Solomon, saying, son, if you don't stay true to God your whole life, if you abandon him, then your throne's not going to last forever. And sadly, towards the end of his life, Solomon started worshiping other gods. So that was the first clue to everybody that, Solomon might not be the one that fulfills completely the Davidic covenant. About 500 years later, things had gotten much, much worse, and another king came to the throne, and this one abandoned God entirely. In fact, he took idols and put them into the Jerusalem temple, the temple that Solomon had built, and he started worshiping other gods in the temple. So at that time, God sent a prophet named Isaiah to give some messages. The first message was a message of doom. It said that God was going to send the people into exile. Most of the people would be exiled in Isaiah's day, and the rest would be exiled later. And at that time, David's dynasty would come to an end. But there was also a second message, and that message was a message of hope. In that message, Isaiah said that the exile would come to an end, it wouldn't be permanent, and then God was going to send another Messiah. He was going to send another anointed king. So let's go ahead and read part of that message, the message of hope. It's found in Isaiah 9, and a lot of you have heard this one before. Isaiah 9, 6-7 reads, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." Just as the Lord said would happen, most of the Israelites went into exile in Isaiah's day. About a century later, the rest of the people went into exile and the dynasty of David ended. But from one of the prophets that was in exile, God gave another message of hope. This one is about a future shepherd, which is what God called the kings, shepherds. It's from Ezekiel 34, 23-24. Let's read it. "And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord. I have spoken." Now, David was dead. So why did God say that this future ruler would be David? Well, there are two reasons. The first reason was to show that it would be a descendant of David who would be the future king, the future shepherd. The second reason is that God was showing that David was a type of this future king, a type. So that leads us to the third way that the Old Testament reveals Jesus, and that is through portents. A portent is something that foreshadows something in the future. That means that Old Testament people, events, and institutions foreshadowed something significant about Jesus and what he did. Now, English translations use a number of different words to describe portents. That includes portents, shadows, copies, patterns, and types. The scholarly word is type. That's what you'll read about the most if you're picking up a book and trying to learn about the Old Testament types that foreshadowed Jesus. By calling the future Messiah David, God was letting us know that King David was a type of the Messiah who was to come. So, when Jesus came, he began to say that scripture that described events in the Old Testament that happened to David foreshadowed events in his own life. For example, at the Last Supper, Jesus took his bread, dipped it in the wine, and gave it to Judas. Judas ate it and then left to betray Jesus. Now here's what Jesus said about that event. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. That's John 13:18. And Jesus is quoting Psalm 41:9. It reads, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. So you see, that event in David's life, where he was betrayed by a friend who had eaten with him, foreshadowed that event in Jesus' life where Judas ate his bread and then betrayed him. So, in summary, the three ways that the Old Testament reveals Jesus are promises, prophecies, and portents. Thanks for watching. Be sure to answer the questions in the comments and then click on that link to go over and get your free timelines. All 7 of them, they're waiting for you over there. And then complete chapter 1 of Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament. You'll see how the Old Testament tells us that Jesus is the Serpent Crusher, and it gives us the hope of evil's end. See you next time.